The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Global Events, How Resilient is the U.S. Economy Against War. My name is Amanda Lambert, the Marketing Assistant at REMI, and I will be your host today. Regional Economic Models, Inc., also known as REMI, is a leading provider of dynamic economic and demographic modeling software and consulting. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Frederick Treyz, the Chief Economist and CEO at REMI. Dr. Treyz is an authority on analyzing public policies and the regional microeconomic and population impacts. Under his leadership, REMI has shaped public policy debates by helping clients evaluate economic development, transportation, energy, immigration reform, and many other topics. This webinar will last for about 1 hour, leaving the last 10 minutes for your questions that Dr. Treyz will answer. The slides and recording of this webinar will also be emailed to you an hour after. So without further ado, I will hand this presentation over to you, Dr. Treyz.
Okay, thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks for joining us today. We want to talk about the U.S. economy, de-globalization, and particularly in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. So the starting point is sort of looking at the economy in the current context before the war started. We show in a modeling context how to look at the effects of an oil price shock, discussion of globalization, deglobalization, looking at another economic modeling simulation for trade, friction, and manufacturing. We'll look at deglobalization and perhaps its benefits for risk mitigation, and then another simulation, resilience against a black Swan event, and then conclusion and questions and answers. So I'll be moving right along in this presentation in terms of our thoughts about how the war, deglobalization, other events can be understood in the context of an economic policy simulation, forecasting and policy simulation model to trace through various implications for the economy. So the context in going into the war, which started just in February, are like not the greatest of economic circumstances to begin with. Still, if we call it post-pandemic, going through a big readjustment, reopening the economy, really we see the inflation spiking, and we can almost see this as time to pay the piper for all the fiscal and monetary stimulus that's occurred for the last 2 years, with the Fed printing money and the federal government increasing deficit spending from the 2020 to 2022 massive monetary and fiscal expansion. There's been a colossal disruption of economic from the pandemic, not just in the U.S. But worldwide, and where we've seen borders close, we've seen supply chain disruptions, we've seen spikes in prices and costs all across the line. First quarter 2022 was the decline of GDP with 8.5% inflation. If this doesn't turn around, we're going to be in an environment of stagflation. And this is all first quarter, just not really even taking into effect the latest massive disruption, which is the Ukraine-Russia war that's spiked oil prices in particular, has put great strain on Europe especially, and then has large worldwide implications as far as what we're calling here deglobalization, sort of a step back from the integration of economies across the globe. So the context is difficult. Then we had this war on top of the thing, and now we have leaked documents from the Supreme Court. So who knows what's going to happen next? War in Ukraine. Start date is Tuesday, February 24, 2022. There's been recent escalation of this. Russia halting the supply of gas to Poland and Bulgaria. NATO's been increasing military aid. Nancy Pelosi just went to Kiev this weekend. There's been renewed Russian bombing of civilian targets. There's really no clear exit strategy that I've seen for how Russia, Ukraine, or frankly NATO disentangles from the situation. So in the future, there's some return to a peaceful southeastern European situation. And then what we would call the world order is under severe strain. It's not just the European order. It brings in Iran, as we say here. Khomeini is saying today the world is on the threshold of a new world order, and a potential realignment into various blocks and arrangements that are sort of disrupting what we had seen as the world order of today. So how does this impact the globe? Damaging to global trade. The IMF is projecting that the volume of imports and exports of goods, that growth, which has been growing steadily from a long time, it's still growing by their projection, but a big drop from 4.7% increase to 3%. Food and fuel crises, which are a strain on U.S. consumers, but when you're looking at food security and wheat consumption for countries such as Egypt and North Africa, that shortages of grain, price spikes for basic bread are politically disruptive. This is what caused the Arab Spring years back. There's effects on inflation and supplies chain shocks. We've seen this with food, European markets for gas, other commodities, and then just this general trend towards deglobalization, where trade blocks are becoming more autarkies instead of free trade regimes. So first, just to jump in of how we can look at this as modeling is, we're just doing here an increase in the world price of oil and gas extraction here of 10%, and we want to look at this in the context of a macroeconomic forecasting and policy simulation model, which we would call a multi-regional U.S., which is composed of 8 major metro areas or counties, so Houston, New York, other major metro areas, and then the remaining region in the model is the remaining rest of the United States, so that each of these regions interacts with each other and then adds up to the total effect on the U.S. economy. So we're just putting in here a change in the oil price. In this particular scenario, we built in a Federal Reserve response to keep employment at full employment, which may or may not be within the control of the Fed at this point, but this particularly emphasizes the relative differences. And then we see that this has a negative effect across all regions of the U.S., including the rest of the U.S., but then for an oil-producing an oil service based county such as Harris County, Texas, there's a positive effect. So we see from this oil and gas shock that generally speaking, most of the U.S. it will do damage to the economy, but of course it will be a benefit to the oil and gas producing regions in the U.S. This next chart gets at one of the main concerns about oil prices and inflation is the effect on budgets. Inflation is one of those economic factors that affects 100% of consumers and 100% of economic participants. So it's very different from unemployment that only impacts a relatively small percentage of people who are out of a job or looking for work. So what this shows is that the consumer price impact for the whole simulation, not just the direct effect of this oil and price increase, will impact the second and middle 20%, a little bit higher than the other wage quintiles in the economy. But it's not a massive difference. It's not a massively higher burden for middle class compared to the lower income or the highest 20% quintile. However, in the second and middle quintiles, there's less discretionary income than there is in the top two quintiles. So when there's an increase in the price of gas, then there's competition for spending more on gas and then reducing spending in other areas, which may be rent, food, clothing, other basic necessities. And in the top two quintiles, if there's an increase in the price of gas, there are more discretionary consumption items that can be cut back on. So it's less of an economic burden if there's the option to scale back consumption in a discretionary area, for example, a vacation or some luxury consumption item in response to this. So we see a lot of pressure from inflation, especially in the middle class. Just stepping back and looking at the concept of globalization compared to deglobalization, is the argument for globalization is that it's a very productive, efficient way to organize production. Each country produces what they're best at with classical trade theory and comparative advantage. GDP increases for all on aggregate, not every player or every company or every firm within the country, but on aggregate, through comparative advantage, every nation that participates in global trade in the global system has GDP and productivity benefits. And also an argument for globalization is that when countries' economies are interconnected and interrelated, and there are a lot of business relationships between countries, there's a lower chance of war and conflict, since it is economically damaging to enter into a war or a conflict. Somebody didn't get the memo on that one. The argument against globalization, sort of broadly speaking, are first that there's a hollowed out manufacturing. So people have looked at the decline of employment in manufacturing jobs in the United States, and part of that responsibility has been through imports, widely replacing domestic production. It leaves countries vulnerable to political decisions made by other countries, which is what we're seeing right now, especially with Europe and the dependency on gas coming in from Russia. And Russia can just cut that off at will. And also there's been an argument against globalization that it widens income inequality. We can look at deglobalization in the U.S. There's inflation, supply shortages, and then I just want to jump right into a simulation here, looking at import costs for manufacturing. So to simulation, import costs for manufacturing, and then an unexpected event or disruption. So in this scenario, I just want to talk about the scenario and then show the output here. We do not have a reaction from the Federal Reserve Bank. So we put in an increase in the cost of tariff of imports, which could be a tariff, let's say, imposed by a government. That increased import and the cost, import cost could also be if there's a movement away from the US dollar as a global reserve currency. So therefore the US dollar declines in value, raising the cost of imports, or it could be some type of trade friction that the ports are clogged, or the because of COVID shutdowns overseas, that goods are going up in price and not being shipped as rapidly. So the major effect of this is to lower employment in the U.S. and also lower GDP. And we'll show graphs for this, but the explanation is the higher import costs results in higher consumer prices, also higher production costs for inputs into production. So like if an auto plant is using tires and steel that's imported from another country, then those higher import costs will translate into higher production costs for the industries using those inputs. The higher consumer prices lead to lower consumption. So as prices go up, people will move away from buying those goods, leading to lower consumption. Output for industries will have higher input costs, but then an offsetting effect. So this is a negative sort of across the board. Higher consumer prices are negative for the macroeconomy. Higher production costs for inputs are negative for the economy. Higher consumer prices leading to lower consumption will reduce final demand and reduce output for input costs. However, for those industries, for the domestic industries that are competing against the foreign imports, there will in fact be some pricing power and pricing protection, which will allow the expansion of domestic industries competing against imports if the price of those imports goes up. So whether it's due to a declining dollar, the imposition of trade barriers, or supply shortages from imports into the United States, the firms, the steel firms, the auto firms, other firms that might otherwise be competing against imports will see a benefit and will be able to increase their employment and output. So just as the aggregate macroeconomic factors, we've seen again, the scenario, just to remind everybody, is it's an increase in import costs for all manufacturing industries. So this reduces employment. It reduces GDP. We see that the price index goes up for consumers, and this leads to lower consumption expenditures. There is an increase in U.S. manufacturing as these industries compete against imports and will benefit from the higher prices of the imports. All other industries see declines, and then we see the same for employment. That manufacturing industry employment goes up, and then in individual or in aggregate, all other industries see employment go down. This chart gets at the distribution of employment by occupational wage quintile. This also comes from the REMI model. This is from the REMI model socioeconomic indicators module, which breaks down employment change by occupational wage quintile as well as other socioeconomic indicators. And we see in this case, this is looking at Michigan, and we've looked at different states and regions across the country, and we see that there's not any clear result consistently across state industries in terms of who benefits and who is harmed by this deglobalization across different wage quintiles. So in this case, in Michigan, all wage quintiles see reduction in employment. It's relatively highest for the middle, fourth, and lowest 20th percentile. It's a little bit less of a job loss for the second 20%. So what we've concluded about looking at this slide and looking at other states and other regions in the country is that although certainly if you consider the protection for manufacturing is good for manufacturing jobs, which we saw in the employment increase for manufacturing, if we're just saying is like it's a positive for the second or the middle or the fourth quintile of wage distribution, we really don't find that, because in each of these wage distributions, they're not exclusively made up of manufacturing workers. There are a lot of service and other workers who see job losses due to sort of this deglobalization, higher import cost scenario. This shows employment by educational attainment, also coming from the REMI socioeconomic indicators module. And as percent here, we see that this higher import costs for manufacturing, that the job losses are greatest for those with high school diploma education, but without college, and there are different losses by different levels of education, but not any clear-cut difference between less educated and more highly educated. In fact, we see that the job losses tend to be higher in percentage terms with a less education, like high school education, or an associate's degree instead of a graduate, doctoral, or professional degree. So I wanted just to introduce another concept of deglobalization and the increasing the domestic supply chain for critical inputs. So one reason to say we might want to have less globalization, more local content is to protect domestic industries, prevent the hollowing out of manufacturing. And we saw when we just increase import costs for manufacturing across the board, in fact, that's a negative for the U.S. economy in aggregate. And even when we look down at detailed groups and occupations and the distributional aspect of that. However, another argument to move away from a globalized system is to mitigate here what I'm calling black swan risk. Now, a black swan sort of risk, it's from Nassim Taleb, wrote a book and sort of coined that phrase, is that a black swan is a rare event, but it does happen from time to time and can have severe consequences. So you might look at the 9/11 attack as being an unpredictable but severe effect, the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So there may be an argument for having increasing the domestic supply chain for critical inputs as making the economy more resilient to future sort of unpredictable but potentially could happen supply shocks. More domestic production, like more chip manufacture in the U.S., more input manufacture for critical inputs could mitigate a potentially negative economic effect of a future disruption. This could result in a higher cost for domestic inputs, sort of a loss of efficiency, because if you have zero trade barriers, producers will just find the lowest cost location. So if you're trying to have domestic inputs, it could be a higher and less efficient way to do things. But then if there's some worldwide disruption or disaster, the economy may end up being more resilient. So what's a potential black swan in the future? Something that's been pointed to is the tensions in the South China Sea. And we'll just note here that there's been a tension starting in 2021 due to Beijing's view that Taiwan is a breakaway province that will eventually have to be reunified with the rest of China. And from Xi, we take this quote: "The historic task of the complete reunification of the motherland must be fulfilled and will definitely be fulfilled." So I just wanted to then look at this in sort of a conceptual framework about how we can measure resilience and use economic tools to provide a policy for a more resilient economy. So we're going to have two shocks here, where we have a max potential loss from the shock, and then if you have a resilience measure, you will have some avoided losses based on that resiliency measure. So the disaster we're putting into place here is some international conflict in the future, which cut off the supply of critical inputs into the motor vehicle industry. So it could be chips. It could also be intermediate inputs in motor vehicles, bodies, and trailers. And this risk of the black swan event could happen at some time in the future, and we're sort of arbitrarily are saying that it's going to happen in 2032. So it's just like any kind of unexpected event. It could be seacoast flooding or tornadoes or an earthquake, that there may be that event happening. We don't know when it's going to happen, but it could happen sometime in the next 10 or 20 years. And the resilience scenario we put in here is to build up domestic supply for critical inputs into motor vehicles, bodies, and trailers, which we're saying will be imposed. The policy mechanism to impose this is by putting tariffs on imports and protecting the domestic industry so that the domestic industry can build up to be able to supply imports and inputs into motor vehicle production domestically. And then the resilience scenario is, suppose this unexpected event happens again in 2032. We assume that now, because you have domestic production for the inputs into motor vehicles, that the industry will be more resilient and therefore won't have this shock of a massive industry drop in 2032 because it's more resilient. So we can show how this looks as a chart, which might even be easier to follow than the other explanation. Is first in red, we set up the disaster baseline control. So we assume that there's some type of event that prevents the motor vehicle industry in the U.S. from getting necessary inputs to maintain its production, and has a very large shutdown and contraction to that industry in 2032. For the resilience scenario, we put into place an increase in tariffs for inputs into the motor vehicle industry. So this causes a drop in output because production is less efficient, inputs are more expensive. So you have reduced output compared to a total free trade situation. But then in 2032, when this black swan event occurs, the industry will be more resilient. So it will only drop about a third of the way as the max potential loss. And then we can also measure this in terms of billions, that the maximum loss potential is $1 trillion. In the resilience scenario, it's $660 billion. So the avoided loss is equal to $401 billion. And this is from the, this scenario is from the REMI E3 Plus model. So in conclusion, the COVID pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war have set the stage for deglobalization. Generally, we see that globalization is efficient at low-cost production because firms are profit maximizing, and consumers want to reduce their costs and can seek out the lowest cost production. There are winners and losers from globalization. And also we need to be aware that the global supply chain, as we've seen with recent events, may be fragile. So one reason for increasing domestic production of things like semiconductors and other critical inputs is to mitigate potential disruptions in the future. Thanks very much for your attention to this presentation. And at this point, Amanda, I'd like to move back to you and I can take some questions and answers.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Fred. That was a great presentation. As he just said, you may ask your questions, and this is the moment where Dr. Treyz will answer them. So with that being said, the first question I have, it actually is towards one of the last slides you were just talking about. And the question is, will increased demand for U.S. military hardware as well as agricultural products provide a positive boost to the U.S. economy, or will it be too narrow to have an impact?
I think the with military hardware, the latest legislation that Biden has put forward is $33 billion. But that is a combination of like not only military hardware but other types of assistance. So as far as the U.S. Economy seeing much stimulus or much economic activity from, you know, quote unquote being on a wartime footing, it still is you know, a large commitment for one country and for like the next 6 months of this defensive effort in terms of the scale for total U.S. GDP. That defense equipment effect is very small in the context of the total economy, and I think the price of grain and the price of wheat will be a benefit to U.S. wheat farmers, but again, in terms of looking at this as a factor in total U.S. GDP, it's still just a very small part, you know, practically negligible effect on U.S. GDP. The price increase for oil and agriculture, I think for oil, that will show up, in fact, in production and employment, because it's a very significant industry in the U.S. And that also has a very significant effect on the inflation rate. And then with the Fed responding to the inflation rate and trying to tamp that down, the price of oil and gas increase is on the scale of being significant enough to impact inflation, Fed policy, the potential for a recession as the Fed tries to tamp down that inflation.
Thank you, Fred. I think that was a pretty good answer to that. The next question is, can the model measure the resilience of environmental disasters due to the war?
The model will be looking at more at the economics of environmental disasters. And when we think of the U.S. and looking at resiliency measures in the U.S., we think of environmental disasters being things such as seacoast flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, that kind of issue. So E3 Plus can look at the resilience for that, but the resilience in terms of economic terms. You know, what effect does it have on industry closure and reopening, on wages and prices, but not like in environmental effects per se.
Okay, thank you, Fred. The next question is, do you have any insight regarding the student loan forgiveness decision that the Biden office would put forward?
I think you know, kind of if you strip it away and look at economic terms, is that in economic terms, one could look at that as being fiscal stimulus, because by reducing debt burden, that effectively unleashes potential for borrowing borrowing and spending more money. There's not that debt burden, so it's fiscally stimulative. So it has that effect. It could potentially have some effect on workforce productivity because it may student loan debt forgiveness may have some potential for encouraging people to improve their education and build their human capital because it's less expensive. So and then there's also the politics of that policy, and which remains to be seen.
Thank you, Fred. The next question is, since most of the supplies is to aid Ukraine are free now, how would that impact the U.S. economy losses? Was this included into account when you were running the model simulations?
The question was the aid to Ukraine?
Yep, Ukraine aid.
And like how's it being paid for, sort of? I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yep. Since most of the supply aided to Ukraine are free, how would that impact the U.S. economy loss?
Well, this $33 billion package that Biden is talking about presumably is going to be funded by the U.S. taxpayer. So that does represent a cost in terms of tax revenues, and then that would also be related to if those are paid for by increasing tax rates, that would be an extra fiscal burden for the United States. So then the question is, what's the cost of national security versus not national security? That I suppose goes again into the black swan. Is if we cut the U.S. military budget by 50%, that would save a lot of money for the U.S. taxpayer, but then presumably that would increase the risk of war and a military disaster in the future. So we're kind of dealing with matching economics here with foreign policy, and really the question is, in a lot of these resilience measures, we can look at defense spending as a resilience measure. We can look at increasing domestic supply of critical inputs as being a resiliency measure. And I think one context to look at resiliency measures is you may have a loss of efficiency. It may be an extra sort of insurance payment against some unforeseen disaster, which could be worth it if you avoid that disaster, and that if you can quantify the effect of that disaster and quantify the benefit of the resilience measure, then you have a more sort of data-driven analytical approach to making policy decisions and making these difficult policy decisions as to how to allocate resources, how to set taxes, and so on.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what does your model expect for the interaction of deglobalization on medium to long-term climate change related to economic impacts?
Um, at one level is if you look very broadly at deglobalization, meaning a less cooperative world order, that would seem to be a negative to environmental and climate change issues, since the whole crux of bringing down carbon worldwide is that we're all in it together, and that nations need to work with each other to bring down carbon worldwide. So if you have a more inwardly focused, if you have blocs or nations more inwardly focused on their narrow self-interest and less focused on the global community, I would think that that would be a negative towards being able to tackle global environmental issues, even agreements, the Paris Accords, and that. That's the. I think that sort of goes back to this concept that connecting economies worldwide would result in sort of the end of war, because why would countries want to fight wars against each other if they're globally interconnected? But we found with the case of Russia is it's not necessarily the case that countries will act in their economic interest, and that in an economically interconnected world is necessarily a guarantee for peace and cooperation.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, some of the imports that the country will have to stop deglobalizing will require new factories, such as the high-end chips that you were discussing before. How does REMI account for the lags in the supply?
They were looking. REMI can look down to 160 different industries based on NAICS codes. We're not really at the granularity of looking at which generation of chips and high-end chips and so on. I'd say if there's a very specific need and input need is that can be identified by a better understanding of the specific engineering technology. There is a lag structure built into the REMI model, and in fact, what we've seen in this chip disruption in the last year is that it can be very difficult for the economy to catch up to sort of a temporary disruption, like a 3 to 6 month disruption, and it can be difficult for the economy to sort of catch up and fill in that disruption when it occurs.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, with all the models that have been presented, is there any correlation that could be discussed regarding domestic items such as the housing market? How well would these model events play against the actual performance of those factors?
Well, the model performance is based on structural econometric equations, which are then estimated based on responses that we find in the data. For example, with housing, during the time of the housing bubble in 2008, the sort of structural general equilibrium framework of REMI had that housing prices would not go up or would not end up in equilibrium as high as what was being observed in the market. But then in the marketplace and what was happening in the actual economy in 2008. But then over the longer term, the housing prices did come back down to like what was projected in the REMI model as a longer term equilibrium. So there may be sort of overshoot in housing markets and other markets. Economics it's a science, but it's an art as well. And one of the things built into REMI is this concept of a long-term general equilibrium response, even if the short term the economy overshoots or undershoots that response.
Okay, thank you, Fred. And I'm going to read you the last 3 questions.
Okay.
And if anybody else has more questions, feel free to email me. I left my email in the question group chat. So definitely feel free if your question does not get answered today. So the next question is, could you give some examples of how the Resiliency Index might be used for assessing national economic policy?
I think this, the idea in national economic policy is what are potential vulnerabilities of the United States, and I think we've come close enough with the chip shortages, which actually has shut down the U.S. auto industry, just only for a matter of weeks this year, that we've had, and also we've seen seacoast flooding and storms, which have cost billions or tens of billions of dollars to repair. So I think that we see in national policy is that efficiency may not be the only goal, and that in some cases it may be worthwhile to have resiliency measures, let's say seacoast flooding, also with infrastructure and repairs to infrastructure to have that more resilient, cybersecurity, those issues, disruptions of the global supply chain. So I think we need a framework for looking at national policies where it's not just a question of short-term economic growth or short-term efficiency, but if there's some external shock, and I've just listed several that might occur, is can we test those and simulate to see how resilient the economy is to these potential future shocks. And yes, I think that should be part of national policy, national infrastructure policy, national security, and other national policies.
Okay. Thank you. With all the scenarios shown today, do you know which countries will win under each circumstance?
Well, if we're talking about the war, sometimes everybody's a loser in war, in the global economy, I think there certainly are concerns for globalization in terms of there are winners and losers within countries. Certain industries can have large job losses, certain occupations, certain regions of the country. So I would suggest there has to be a balance between how do we defend against this, the disruption caused to the industries that might lose from global trade, but given the expansion of worldwide productivity that we've had in the post-World War II period, with the opening of economies, the sort of steady expansion of trade and international cooperation, I think it's better to think of like how do we develop win-win scenarios that are going to benefit countries broadly, rather than being in a mentality of who's the winner and who's the loser and who's taking advantage of the other party.
Okay. Thank you, Fred. And the last question of today's webinar is, it looks like the negative effects on employment and income from the negative shocks are an order of -1%. How acute would the people in the U.S. feel the effects given the annual growth in employment and incomes is in the order of 3%?
The scenarios I presented today, I would call them conceptual scenarios. We're looking at increase in manufacturers. We're looking at some type of potential disruption. So I would suggest before we really begin to thinking of quantifying and recommending a certain policy, that the numbers in the simulation setup should be really reflect much more closely sort of an existing policy proposal that's out there. So I wouldn't take the quantification of these results too closely, in that the presentation was looking more at issues of globalization and deglobalization from more of a conceptual framework rather than a specific policy recommendation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that, Fred. That was a wonderful webinar. Again, if you have any questions that you feel weren't answered or you have some that you just thought about, feel free to email me at amanda.lambert@remi.com, and you all will receive a email for the slides and the recording today. And with that, again, thank you again, Fred, for your time for the webinar today.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks to all of those participating. And thank you, Amanda.